Since the 1990s, the Initiative for a Competitive Inner City has been trying to change the mapping of economic opportunity. That means reimagining areas with a history of disinvestment as fertile ground for growth and innovation. That could even include a pipeline to the growing demand for new developments in information technology. One example of that is a company based in Roxbury, Onyx Spectrum Technology, listed among the initiative's 100 fastest growing companies in under-resourced areas. We'd like to welcome the company's CEO, Adrian Benton. Thank you very much for being with us, Adrian.
Hello, pleasure. Thank you.
Adrian, I want to start with the pathway that you took to this company, because as an undergrad, you studied urban planning and public health, and you ended up in IT. How did that happen?
Well, when I was in college as an undergrad, I had never touched a computer because that was back in the 70s, early 80s. And so when I got to graduate school, I went to University of Alabama, Birmingham, where I received a Master's of Science in Hospital and Health Administration. Everything had to be done on computer. Remember those Tandy one-piece units and IBM one-piece units? And you almost had to know how to code to produce a document. So I got really good at it, because if I didn't get good at it, I wouldn't be able to keep up with the output of the work that we had to do. And so once I started working in healthcare, I always teamed up with the IT department to create some innovative ways to help streamline processes and make work a little easier for our frontline staff in certain areas. For example, central supply, where they handle all of the surgical instruments and things like that. We created some learning tools for the staff and all that, so they could learn what the different instruments were called and how to develop kits and things of that sort. So I always had an interest. And when I left healthcare in 1996, I started working with smaller businesses, showing them how to get on the internet, because a lot of businesses at the time really didn't know how to set up a website and all those different things. And then from there, the interest evolved, and I volunteered for a small software company called Inner City Software, and they're a Black-owned company. They're still around today, and the owner's name was Ken Granderson. And I volunteered with his company probably for a year and a half or so, and just to learn all the different programming disciplines in terms of what types of code people had to know, programming languages and things of that sort, so I could really understand how this whole web piece worked, how the internet worked, and how businesses could interface with that. But first, I had to understand how you make things happen, how you create things. And so basically, when I founded my company in 2004, we started working with the state of Massachusetts. Eventually, we teamed up with a lot of different companies like EMA and Deloitte and others doing projects with the state. And then we branched out into supporting federal transportation, as well as the Department of Defense. Most of the work that we do is in communications, sensors, and surveillance work.
Well, you've gotten some important contracts to do important work for big systems. Other people might have competed for those contracts, but you were the one who won the competition. So what did you bring that maybe they didn't?
Well, I think that number one, we have a very unique niche. Back in 2012, after the whole bottom fell out of the economy between 2006, 2008, I had to think about, how does my company diversify? How do we really find more of a niche for ourselves? So we did two things in particular. Number one is we decided, hey, we need to team up with larger companies to provide a service to help enhance the services they provide. So that's when we teamed up with companies like Deloitte and EMA and KBR Wiley and others. And then from there, I said, I want to get into some type of serviceable products, not just doing the consulting piece. And so I talked to my advisors, and that's where I found out the whole electronics end of life, communication support, electronic support, and all the other stuff. I found out about that industry, so to speak. And from there, started looking for companies to team up with. Really couldn't find any companies to team up with, but there was an acquisition opportunity. So I had an opportunity to buy a small company that was in Littleton, Mass. We did what's called an asset purchase. So basically, we purchased all their assets and not necessarily the company itself, even though they did subsequently, close their company, their corporation down. But that's how we got into the electronic support, repair, refurbishment, maintenance plans, and things of that sort. So we were in Littleton for a while, and then we moved our operations to Lawrence. We actually have 10,000 square feet of light manufacturing and test space in Lawrence. I work from a home office here in Roxbury. That's what a corporation has been for some time. But most of our team members were all decentralized all over the country. We have team members in Missouri, New York, here in Massachusetts, and also New Jersey and California. So I have people that are kind of spread out all over the place, and of course in Lawrence at our facility there. So yeah, it's been an evolution, so to speak.
Well, in IT, you can be everywhere while you're sitting in one place, but at the same time, geographically, you're close to the cluster of all these medical institutions that have IT needs, but you're also close to, the pandemic, the disparities. Do you have any ripple effect into those worlds?
Well, I think that whenever you live in a community, you are affected by what happens in that community. So when the pandemic started, I made it a point to say, hey, we want to help support organizations that are within like a 2-mile radius of my corporate office here in Boston, as well as our facility in Lawrence. And so we started making donations to organizations rather, that were feeding people, that were providing certain resources to help people through the pandemic, because sometimes it just takes cash to help provide immediate help to people. So in Lawrence, when the gas explosion happened, for example, we contributed to some organizations that were helping to provide shelter as well as clothing and things like that to people that had been displaced. So.
One of the other things that strikes me, it's almost too obvious to ask about. You're working in a field that a lot of us, at least as onlookers from the outside, picture as overwhelmingly white and male. You're not either of those. So what's it like for you to be functioning with the rest of that field?
Well, it is always very interesting. Prior to LinkedIn, people using LinkedIn a lot and seeing pictures of people, basically, I would get mistaken for maybe a spouse of my colleague, or that I really wasn't the CEO. They start talking to one of my other colleagues who were male, whether or not they were black or white or anything, and also sometimes I wouldn't necessarily be viewed as the right person for people to talk to when I walk in a room. A lot of it, a lot of times it's subtle, but I've learned kind of how to navigate around it. So I kind of plan ahead of time. So if I come into a room for a meeting, I make sure that I introduce myself right away and things of that sort. So that way I don't necessarily have to always be affected by some of those things that happened if I didn't do those things. And of course, it's extra work. There's a lot of extra work that we have to do as women, as well as Black people. A lot of work that we have to do before we walk into a door. So definitely sometimes the immediate credibility that white males receive is something that I don't get. And so a lot of times I have to make sure, like for example, when I started in the electronics area for my business, I had to make sure that we got our ISO certification. Now, with all of the cybersecurity requirements that there are for the federal government, I'm making sure that we have our CMMC level 3. I'm making sure that we have our NIST certification and all those things, because I get asked a lot of questions and I'm challenged on a lot of things that white males don't always get challenged on. Sometimes it's just an assumption when they may not even have those credentials for their company, but they get to walk in the door and they get to have, an immediately friendly conversation. Whereas I get the question, are you ISO certified, for example? Are you this? Are you that? What have you done? So I have to be pre-prepared all the time. And sometimes for small Black owned businesses, that also translates into our having to spend a lot more money up front than another company has to spend. Sometimes some folks can just say, hey, I do that and don't have to spend any money. And then they get the contract, and then they're able to spend that money from the contract to build their business. With me, I had to essentially build the business to build some credibility and to have everything in place that I needed before I went after that first contract.
One other perception issue we might have here in Boston is that there are a lot of young people growing up right now, going to school, who don't see themselves in IT, and maybe people around them have perceptions that don't see these young people in IT. What should they be thinking of about possibilities? What would you tell them?
Well, sometimes you can't be it if you don't see it, you know. Even me becoming a hospital administrator, I mean, you know, I had some family members and friends and other people that I had some point of reference to. But some of the stuff that I do, there's really not a big point of reference. So I think that it is important for us to steer young people to seek out um, opportunities or things that are different. For example, I have a speaking engagement coming up with the 3 Point Foundation. And so that's going to put me in front of, you know, 12, 13-year-olds. And I'm going to be able to talk about what my company does and talk about my journey from growing up in Newark, New Jersey to doing the things that I'm doing now. And so I think just that conversation is going to help to expose them to some of the different things that they can think about doing. Right now, I think we just have a vacuum in making that connection between our youth and what the possibilities are, because a lot of times those conversations don't take place around the kitchen table. I know for myself growing up, you know, there were a lot of things that we talked about, but at the same time, my parents weren't necessarily foreseeing different types of careers that I could go into. They knew, you know, you could be doctor, lawyer, you can go work in administration somewhere, different types of things. But at the same time, there is a certain lack of information that we just have because we're just not in it, just not exposed to it. It's like the whole conversation around finance. You know, I didn't know about stocks and bonds in terms of, you know, I had heard about them. I knew about Wall Street, but didn't know how I could take part in that, you know, and until somebody told me, or until I was able to read about certain things and got exposed to certain things, then it opened up a whole new world. Like, oh, I can actually buy a piece of a company. I can do this or do that. So I think it's closing the exposure and information gap. And I think it's incumbent upon people like myself to seek out opportunities like talking with the 3 Point Foundation kids and different different organizations. I'm a marathoner and a pretty avid runner, and I'm involved with the National Black Marathoners Association. I actually was just invited to become a member of the Boston Athletic Association. I think they call it Membership Advisory Group or something of that sort. I forget the exact name, but I'm just happy that through them, as well as Black Girls Run, I'm able to talk to young people and to not just talk about running, but talk about those other things that I do. Running just helps sort of enable us to have that initial conversation.
Well,
Yeah.
well, thank you very much for sharing that conversation, expanding it a little wider, for being with us and taking the time too.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
That was Adrian Benton from Onyx Spectrum Technology. We'll have more news in just a moment.